For 38 years, I ran my own store, 6 days a week, sunrise to closing, never once taking more than a few days off at a time. There was always a reason to wait. The business, the children, one more year of saving. But there was one trip my husband and I kept promising ourselves and kept postponing: the Maldives. At 62 years old, standing outside my shop one evening, I finally asked myself how many more years I was willing to wait for a life I had already earned. This is the story of the trip that changed how I saw everything I had spent my life building, and what I decided to do differently once I came home. The keys felt heavier than usual in my hand that evening. I stood outside the shutter of my shop for a long moment before pulling it down, the way I had done thousands of times before. But that particular evening, something in me paused. Across the street, a young couple was studying a folded paper map, laughing about something, pointing at a photograph on one of their phones. I couldn't see what it was, but I didn't need to. I recognized that look. It was the look of two people planning a trip they were actually going to take. I locked up, walked to my car, and sat there for a few minutes without starting the engine. My husband, Vikram, called to ask if I was still at the store. "I'm coming," I told him. "Just tired today." But it wasn't tiredness, not really. It was something quieter than that, something that had been sitting in my chest for longer than I wanted to admit. My name is Anjali. I am 62 years old, and for 38 years I have run a small business here in New Jersey, a modest store that sells Indian groceries, spices, sweets, and the small comforts that people from home find hard to live without. I did not plan to spend my whole life behind a counter. Nobody plans that. Not really. Life simply arranges itself that way, one decision folding into the next, until one day you look up and 38 years have quietly become your whole adult life. I grew up in Ahmedabad, in a house with a courtyard where my mother dried popads on the roof, and my father kept a small radio that only worked if you tilted the antenna at a certain angle. We were not wealthy, but we were not without dignity either. My father used to say that a person who works with their hands never has to lower their head in front of anyone, and I have carried that sentence with me my whole life, sometimes as strength, and sometimes, I confess, as a burden. I met Vikram when I was 24, at my cousin's wedding in Baroda. He was quiet in a way that made people mistake him for shy, though anyone who knew him well understood that his silence was simply him thinking carefully before speaking. We were married within a year, and 2 years after that, we came to the United States, following an opportunity that Vikram's older brother had helped arrange, a modest position in a small engineering firm in New Jersey that no longer exists. We did not arrive with grand dreams of becoming wealthy. We arrived hoping simply to build something steady, a life we would not have to explain or apologize for, a life where our children, if we had them, would have more choices than we did. We had two, a son, Rohan, who is now an anesthesiologist in Chicago, and a daughter, Priya, who works in marketing in Austin. Both of them are married, both of them call on Sundays, and both of them, in their own polite ways, have stopped asking me when I am going to finally take a break, because they have asked so many times over the years that the question has become something we all silently agreed to stop repeating. I opened the store in the second year after we arrived, in a small strip mall next to a laundromat and a shoe repair shop that has changed owners 4 times since. In the beginning, it was just a few shelves, dal, rice, some spices imported through a distributor in Edison. Slowly over the years, it grew. I added fresh produce, then frozen parathas, then a small section for puja items, then greeting cards for Diwali and Rakhi that I ordered specially each year from a supplier in Jersey City. People sometimes assume that owning a shop for so long means the work becomes easy, familiar, almost automatic. It does become familiar, that part is true, but it never really becomes easy. There is always a delivery that comes late, a supplier who raises prices without warning, a refrigerator that stops working on the one weekend before a festival when everyone needs paneer. For 38 years, my mind rarely had a day when it was completely empty of the store. Even on vacations, the very few we took, some part of me was doing inventory in my head. And somewhere in all of that, quietly, without any dramatic moment attached to it, Vikram and I began talking about the Maldives. I don't even remember exactly when it started. I think it was a photograph, a small wooden bungalow, standing on stilts over water so clear you could see the sand beneath it, the kind of blue that doesn't look real in a picture. Vikram had seen it in a magazine at the dentist's office of all places, and he mentioned it to me that evening almost as a joke. "Imagine sitting there," he said, "with nothing to do but watch fish." I laughed, because the idea of me, a woman who has not taken a day off in a single week for as long as I can remember, sitting somewhere with nothing to do, seemed almost impossible to picture. But something about it stayed with me. Over the years, it became a small, recurring conversation between us, usually late at night, usually right before sleep, when the day's exhaustion had softened enough to let a little bit of dreaming through. After Rohan finishes his residency, we'll go. After Priya's wedding is settled, we'll go. After we pay off the loan for the new refrigeration unit, we'll go. Every year, there was a reason, and every year, the reason made sense at the time. I am not someone who regrets the choices I made. I want to be clear about that. We needed to be careful with money in those early years. We needed to save for our children's education, and later, for their weddings. There were real reasons behind every postponement, not excuses invented to avoid the trip. But reasons, even good ones, have a way of quietly adding up into decades. That evening, sitting in the car outside my shop, watching that young couple across the street with their map and their laughter, I found myself doing a kind of arithmetic I usually avoided. 38 years since we opened the store. 34 years since that magazine photograph. 62 years since I was born in that house in Ahmedabad, with the papads drying on the roof. I am not a woman who cries easily, and I didn't cry that evening either. But I sat there longer than I needed to, thinking about my father's sentence about never lowering your head, and wondering, for the first time in a long while, whether there was a difference between working hard and simply forgetting how to stop. When I finally got home, Vikram was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, still in his cardigan from the cooler weather outside. He looked at me the way he does when he already senses something before I've said a word. "You're quiet," he said. I sat down at the table, and for a moment, I didn't know exactly how to say what was sitting in my chest. So I said the simplest version of it. "I think I want to go," I told him. "The Maldives. I don't want to wait for another reason to come along." Vikram turned the stove down and looked at me for a long moment, not with surprise exactly, but with something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting a long time for me to say those words out loud. "Are you sure?" he asked. The store has survived worse than me taking 2 weeks off," I said. And even as I said it, I realized I half believed it and half doubted it, both at the same time. He smiled, the small, quiet smile I had fallen for at that wedding in Baroda 39 years ago. "Then let's go," he said. "Properly, this time. No more, next year." I didn't know yet, sitting at that kitchen table, everything that trip would end up meaning to me, how many things I would understand differently by the time we came home. I only knew that for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had said now instead of later, and that small change in a single word felt larger than it probably should have. Anjali and Vikram booked flights for early March, giving themselves 6 weeks to prepare. In some ways, those 6 weeks tested Anjali's resolve more than the trip itself would. The first hurdle was the store. Anjali had one part-time employee, a young woman named Sunita, who had worked with her for the last 4 years, mostly restocking shelves and helping at the register on weekends. Anjali had never fully trusted anyone else with the ordering, the supplier relationships, the small judgment calls that came up daily, which batch of mangoes to reject, which customers' credit to extend, when to mark down items nearing their date. "You worry too much," Vikram told her one evening, watching her make a 3-page list of instructions for Sunita. "It's 2 weeks, Anjali. Not 2 years. 2 weeks is enough time for everything to fall apart," she said, only half joking. But she wrote the list anyway, and then rewrote it, and then called her nephew Kunal, who lived 40 minutes away and had helped at the store during his college summers, asking if he could check in a few times while they were gone. Kunal agreed easily, the way young people agree to things without understanding yet how much weight the person asking is carrying. The second hurdle was quieter and harder to name. It was the discomfort of simply not knowing how to be a person on vacation. Anjali realized this one Saturday afternoon while helping Vikram look up hotels. He had found a small resort with overwater bungalows, modest by Maldives standards, but still more than they had ever spent on a single trip. "This one," he said, turning the laptop toward her. "Look at the water." She looked, and it was beautiful, impossibly clear, the kind of blue she associated with postcards rather than real places. But her mind, almost against her will, immediately went to the cost. "For how many nights?" she asked. 7. She did the math quickly, the way she did math for everything, out of habit rather than necessity. 7 nights, at that rate, was more than she typically spent on inventory in an entire month. "We could do 5 nights, she said. "Save a little." Vikram closed the laptop gently and looked at her. "Anjali, we've been saving for 30 years. If not now, when?" She didn't answer right away because she didn't fully understand her own instinct to pull back. It wasn't that they couldn't afford it. They could, comfortably. Their children were settled, the store was doing fine, and they had put away enough over the decades that this trip, luxurious as it seemed, would barely dent their savings. The resistance she felt wasn't financial. It was something older and less logical than money. "I don't know how to just spend on myself," she finally said. "It feels strange." Vikram reached over and took her hand, an unusual gesture for him in the middle of the day, when they were usually each doing separate tasks in separate corners of the house. "You've spent 38 years making sure everyone else had what they needed," he said. "The children, the store, even me. I think you're allowed to not know how to do this yet, but we can learn together." They booked the 7 nights. The third hurdle, the one Anjali hadn't expected at all, came from her daughter Priya. Anjali called her one evening, as she did most weeks, and mentioned the trip almost in passing, the way she mentioned most things about herself, always folded into questions about Priya's own life first. "Wait, you're actually going?" Priya said, her voice rising with something between surprise and delight. "Mom, that's amazing. You've been talking about the Maldives since I was in middle school." "I know," Anjali said, a little embarrassed by how long it had actually taken. "Are you nervous?" The question caught Anjali off guard, mostly because she hadn't admitted the answer to herself yet. "A little," she said. "It feels strange to go somewhere just to relax. I don't think I've ever done that. Even our trips to India were always about visiting family, helping with something, attending some function." There was a pause on the line, and then Priya said something that stayed with Anjali long after they hung up. "Mom, I think you've spent so long being the person who takes care of things that you forgot you're also allowed to just exist somewhere beautiful. You don't have to earn rest. You've already earned it, like several times over." Anjali didn't have a response ready for that. She simply said, "I'll bring you something nice," which made Priya laugh, and the conversation moved on to easier things. But that sentence, "you don't have to earn rest," settled into her chest and stayed there, quietly, for days. The morning they left for the airport, Anjali stood in the store one last time, running her hand along the edge of the counter she had stood behind nearly every day for 38 years. Sunita was already there, tying her apron, and Kunal had promised to stop by that afternoon. "You have my number," Anjali said. "If anything—" "Auntie," Sunita interrupted gently, smiling. "Go. We will be fine. Enjoy your trip." It was such a simple sentence, but Anjali felt something loosen in her chest as she heard it, as though she had been given permission she didn't know she needed. The flight was long, first to Doha, then a connection down to Malé, and finally a smaller propeller plane that skimmed low over water so vividly blue it looked almost unreal, dotted with small green islands that seemed too perfectly shaped to be natural. Anjali sat by the window for that last leg, her forehead nearly touching the glass, watching the shadow of the plane pass over reefs and shallows. "It looks like the photograph," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Better," Vikram said, watching her face rather than the view. "You look happy." She hadn't realized she was smiling. They arrived at the resort in the late afternoon, greeted with cold towels and a fruit drink Anjali didn't recognize but liked immediately, something tart and sweet, with a hint of pandan. Their bungalow stood on stilts, exactly as it had in the magazine photograph all those years ago, a small wooden deck extending over water so clear that Anjali could see fish moving beneath it, thin silver shapes flickering in and out of coral shadows. She stood on that deck for a long time that first evening, alone for a few minutes while Vikram unpacked inside, watching the sun lower itself slowly into the water, the sky turning shades of orange and pink she didn't have adequate words for, not in English and not in Gujarati either. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her mind was not making a list. She was not thinking about tomorrow's delivery or Sunita's schedule, or whether the walk-in refrigerator's compressor would hold up in the March heat back home. She was simply standing there, watching the sky change color over water, feeling something in her chest that she eventually recognized, with some surprise, as stillness. She didn't know yet how much that stillness would grow to mean to her over the coming days, or what it would eventually ask of her once she returned home. But standing there that first evening, watching the light fade over the reef, Anjali allowed herself, for perhaps the first time in 38 years, to simply not think about anything at all. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Anjali had never experienced before, not because the days themselves were unusual, but because of how empty they were of obligation. She woke without an alarm. She and Vikram had breakfast on their deck most mornings, the resort staff bringing trays of fresh fruit, idly, and a coffee that Anjali found too weak at first, and then, by the third day, started to look forward to anyway. There was a rhythm to doing nothing that she hadn't expected. Not laziness, but a kind of attentiveness she had forgotten how to practice. She noticed things. The particular way the light moved across the water at different hours. The sound of a hermit crab dragging its shell across the sand. The taste of a fruit she'd never had before, called custard apple by the waiter, but different from the version she remembered from her childhood in Ahmedabad. On the third day, they went snorkeling for the first time in their lives. Anjali was nervous about it, more nervous than she wanted to admit to Vikram, who took to it immediately with the enthusiasm of someone 20 years younger. She stood at the edge of the boat for a long moment, mask in hand, feeling foolish. "I don't have to do this," she said. "You don't." The young instructor, a local man named Ahmed, agreed easily. "But the reef just there is very calm, shallow. I'll stay beside you the whole time," she thought, standing there. Of all the times in her life, she had avoided something simply because it was unfamiliar. Not out of real fear, but out of a kind of practiced caution that had served her well running a business, but had also, she was beginning to realize, quietly narrowed the shape of her life over the years. She put the mask on. The first few minutes were disorienting. The sound of her own breathing through the snorkel, the strange sensation of floating face down in water that went on much longer than she expected. But then Ahmed pointed, and she looked, and beneath her was a world she hadn't imagined even from the photographs. Coral in shapes she had no names for, fish in colors that seemed almost painted on, a small reef shark, harmless and uninterested, gliding beneath them with an unhurried grace that Anjali found herself thinking about for days afterward. When she surfaced, pulling the mask off, Vikram was floating nearby, grinning at her like a boy. "Well?" he asked. "I don't know why we waited so long," she said, and meant it in a way that went beyond the swimming. That evening, over dinner at a small restaurant built out over the water, Vikram brought up something Anjali hadn't expected. "I've been thinking," he said, turning his glass slowly on the table, "about what happens when we go back." Anjali felt a small tightening in her chest, the store already pulling at her thoughts even from thousands of miles away. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want this to be a trip we took once and then go back to exactly how things were. I don't want you disappearing into that store again for another 10 years. Vikram, the store is how we— "I know what the store is," he said gently, not unkindly. "I'm not asking you to close it. I know what it means to you. I'm asking whether there's a different way to run it, a way that doesn't require you there from 6 in the morning until closing, 6 days a week." Anjali sat with that for a moment, watching the water darken beneath the restaurant's lights. Small fish gathering near the surface where the light met the water. "I don't know how to do it differently," she admitted. "I built it a certain way. Every part of it, I built with my own hands, my own decisions. It's hard to imagine trusting someone else with that." "I'm not talking about someone else," Vikram said. "I'm talking about you, deciding that you're allowed to build it a little smaller, a little lighter, so there's room left over for you." She didn't have an answer that evening, and Vikram didn't push for one. That was, she thought later, One of the things she loved most about him after 39 years of marriage, he knew how to plant something and then simply let it grow at its own pace without demanding an immediate harvest. Over the remaining days, the conversation returned, gently, a few more times, never as an argument, always as a genuine exploration. They talked about Sunita, who had been with the store for 4 years and had, Anjali realized as she talked about her, grown into someone far more capable than Anjali had given her credit for. They talked about Kunal, who had mentioned once or twice, almost shyly, that he enjoyed the few afternoons he'd spent helping at the store more than he expected to. Maybe, Anjali said on their 6th evening, watching the last light fade from a sky striped with color, maybe I don't need to hold every single piece of it myself. That would be a start, Vikram said. On their last full day, they took a small boat out to a sandbank that appeared only at low tide, a strip of white sand rising out of the ocean with nothing else around it, water on every side, no other visitors, no structures, nothing but sand, sky, and the sound of small waves. They sat there for nearly 2 hours, mostly in silence, occasionally pointing out a bird or a fish, or simply the particular color the water turned as the sun moved. I keep thinking about something my father used to say, Anjali said eventually, her feet buried in the warm sand, that a person who works with their hands never has to lower their head in front of anyone. That's a good thing to believe, Vikram said. It is, but I think I turned it into something else, somewhere along the way. I think I started believing that if I ever stopped working, even for a little while, I would be lowering my head, as if resting was a kind of failure. Vikram was quiet for a moment, considering this. Your father built dignity out of work, he said finally. I don't think he meant for you to build a prison out of it. Anjali laughed softly, surprised by how exactly that captured something she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. She looked out at the water, at the impossible blue of it, at the horizon where sea met sky without any visible seam. 38 years, she said quietly. I don't regret them. I want to be clear about that. Even to myself. We built something real. Our children had chances we didn't have. That store paid for Rohan's education, for Priya's wedding, for this trip we're sitting on right now. I know, Vikram said, but I think I forgot, somewhere in the middle of all that building, that I was allowed to also just be here, not earning anything, not accomplishing anything, just being here. She didn't cry, sitting on that sandbank in the middle of the ocean, though she came close. Instead, she simply sat with the feeling, letting it settle into her the way the warm sand settled around her feet, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel any urgency to turn the feeling into a decision, a plan, or a task. That would come later. For now, it was enough to simply sit beside her husband on a strip of sand that would disappear beneath the tide by evening and let herself, fully and without apology, be exactly where she was. The flight home felt shorter than the flight there, though it was, if anything, slightly longer. Anjali slept for parts of it, something she rarely did on planes, waking each time a little disoriented, a little sun-warmed even in the recycled cabin air, as though the Maldives had left something in her skin that hadn't faded yet. Sunita met them at the store the morning after they landed, before Anjali had even fully unpacked. She hadn't asked her to. Anjali had told her to take the day, let things settle. But Sunita was there anyway, sweeping the front step, when Anjali pulled up. Auntie, you're tan, Sunita said, laughing, before Anjali had even gotten out of the car. How was everything? Anjali asked, walking in, eyes moving automatically across the shelves, the register, the small stack of mail on the counter. Fine, Sunita said. We ran low on Tourdale on Thursday, so I called the Edison supplier myself, like you showed me once. Kunal came by twice. One customer complained the samosas were too oily, but I think she complains about everything. Anjali laughed, surprised at how much she meant it. She walked the aisles slowly, checking things out of habit rather than necessity, and found, to her mild astonishment, that everything was more or less exactly as she had left it. Not perfect, a few things out of place, a display she would have arranged differently, but functioning, whole, standing on its own 2 feet without her holding it up every hour of every day. It shouldn't have surprised her as much as it did. Over the following weeks, Anjali found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, paying attention to Sunita, Really paying attention, the way you notice a person properly, only once you've stepped back far enough to see them clearly. Sunita had a sharper mind for numbers than Anjali had given her credit for. A way of talking to difficult customers that was gentler than Anjali's own, more patient. Kunal, when he came by on weekends, showed an interest in the ordering and supplier relationships that surprised even him. One Tuesday evening, closing up together, Anjali asked Sunita a question she had been turning over in her mind for days. Would you want more hours? More responsibility? I could teach you the ordering properly, not just calling when we run low, but planning it, working with the suppliers directly. Sunita looked up from the register, genuinely startled. You would trust me with that? I think, Anjali said slowly, I've been the only one carrying this for so long that I forgot it was possible to share the weight without dropping it. They worked out an arrangement over the following month. Nothing dramatic, no sudden transformation of the business. Sunita took on the ordering 2 days a week, with Anjali reviewing rather than doing it herself. Kunal began coming in every Saturday, officially now, paid properly, learning the supplier relationships Anjali had spent decades building. Anjali kept the mornings, the parts of the day she genuinely loved, the quiet hour before opening, arranging the fresh produce, greeting the regular customers by name, the small rituals that had never felt like burdens, only the things around them that had grown too heavy. By the middle of the year, Anjali was leaving most days by 4 in the afternoon instead of closing at 8. The first few weeks, she didn't entirely know what to do with the extra hours. She caught herself, more than once, driving toward the store out of habit before remembering she didn't need to be there. She used some of that time, at Vikram's gentle suggestion, to finally learn to make the fish curry her mother-in-law used to make, the recipe she'd been given in a notebook 20 years ago and never once opened. She used some of it to call Priya not just on Sundays, but occasionally in the middle of the week, for no particular reason, just to talk. She used some of it to sit on their small back porch in the late afternoon with a cup of tea, doing nothing at all, an activity that had felt strange and almost illicit the first few times, and slowly, over weeks, began to feel like something she was allowed to have. In September, Rohan called with news that surprised them both. He and his wife were expecting their first child, due in the spring. Anjali cried on the phone, openly, something she rarely did, and when she hung up, she found herself thinking not about grocery lists or store schedules, but about the years ahead, about being the kind of grandmother who had time, actual, unhurried time, to give a child rather than a grandmother squeezing visits between deliveries and inventory. I want to go for the birth, she told Vikram that night. Not for a weekend, for a real visit, a month maybe. Chicago in spring, Vikram said, smiling. I'll come too. It struck her, saying it out loud, how easily the sentence had come to her. A month away from the store, spoken without the old tightening in her chest, without the mental arithmetic of who would cover what, and whether everything would survive without her. 6 months earlier, that sentence would have taken her days to work up to. Now it arrived almost naturally, like something she had simply been waiting to give herself permission to say. In October, on a Sunday drive that had no particular destination, Vikram brought up the Maldives again, unprompted. We should go back one day, he said. Not soon, but one day. Or somewhere new, Anjali said. There's a whole world we haven't seen. She surprised herself with how easily that came out too. The assumption, now settled and unremarkable, that there would be more trips. Not someday, not eventually, not after some final obstacle was cleared, but simply as a regular part of the life they were now living, alongside the store, alongside the grandchildren to come, alongside everything else. Her father's sentence still visited her sometimes. A person who works with their hands never has to lower their head in front of anyone. But it sat differently in her now. She understood it, finally, as something her father had meant as a floor, not a ceiling, a foundation to stand on, not a debt that could never be considered paid. She had built her dignity through 38 years of work, and that dignity, she now understood, did not evaporate the moment she also allowed herself an afternoon of rest, a week on a beach, a Tuesday spent doing nothing more urgent than making fish curry badly for the first time. The following March, Anjali stood in a hospital hallway in Chicago, holding her first grandson for the first time, a small, warm weight against her chest. Rohan exhausted and glowing beside his wife's bed, Priya having flown in the day before. Vikram taking photographs on his phone with the concentration of a much younger man. "What are you going to teach him first?" Priya asked, teasing. "How to run a store." Anjali looked down at the small face, eyes barely open, entirely unaware of the room around him, and thought about the question more seriously than Priya had probably intended. "I think," she said slowly, "I'll teach him that it's all right to work hard for the things that matter, and also that it's all right to stop sometimes and just look at the water." Priya raised an eyebrow, not quite understanding, and Anjali only smiled, because some things were easier lived than explained. Back home in New Jersey that summer, the store continued much as it always had. The same shelves, the same customers, the same rhythm of deliveries and festivals and quiet Tuesday afternoons. But it ran differently now, held up by more than one pair of hands, and Anjali found she trusted it that way, trusted Sunita and Kunal, trusted the version of herself that no longer needed to hold every single piece alone in order to feel that the whole thing was safe. Some evenings, closing up a little earlier than she used to, she would walk out to the car and pause. The way she had that evening over a year ago, watching some ordinary scene across the street, a couple walking a dog, teenagers waiting for a bus, the last light going gold over the strip mall's parking lot, and where once that pause had carried a quiet ache, a sense of something postponed and slipping further away with each passing year, it now carried something closer to contentment. Not because every dream had been fulfilled. There were still places she hadn't seen, still books unread, still 100 small things she hadn't gotten around to, but because she had finally learned, at 62, that a life could hold both the work and the rest, both the sacrifice and the sitting still, without either one canceling out the other. She thought, sometimes, of that sandbank in the middle of the ocean, disappearing beneath the tide by evening, and of how she had sat there, fully present, without needing to turn the moment into anything more than what it was. That, she had come to believe, was the real thing she had brought home from the Maldives. Not a suntan, not a handful of photographs, not even the decision to change how she ran her business, though all of that mattered too. What she had brought home was simpler and larger than any of it. The understanding that after 38 years of building a life through work, she was finally, fully, allowed to also live in it.